Battle Spirits Saga has a problem of Netherworld proportions. Hey everybody, Espira, and we're back with another Battle Spirits Saga video. This time we're going to be jumping into one of the key cards that has really centralized the format, especially as we jump into the second set False Gods, and we finally have some tournaments to back up kind of how we're expected to see the rest of the meta play out. Specifically, we're talking about Netherworld Depths, a card that can basically decide the tide of the game depending on if it can be answered or not. And I think it is so centralizing that it's actually worth having a talk about. But before we jump into it, a quick message from today's video sponsor. Experience the thrill of battle with Paragon, a fast-paced trading card game that combines exciting mechanics with strategic positional gameplay. In Paragon, you command an army of creatures inspired by the worlds of fantasy tabletop RPGs, each with their own combat skills and abilities. Fight for control of a 4x4 battlefield grid. The game plays out like a marriage of NTG's Commander and Final Fantasy's Triple Triad, which is right up my alley. I had a chance to sit down with the devs and talk about how the game is played and the plans they have for the ecosystem, and I'm so excited for what they're bringing to the TCG landscape. The game is coming to Kickstarter this fall, but if you want to get on the action ahead of time, the Paragon team have created a VIP pass that will grant you an additional 3 booster packs upon making a $10 pledge or more towards their campaign when it launches. For a limited time, my viewers can use the link down below to get in on the VIP pass for just $1. The campaign will feature a Founders Edition print run of the first set, with stretch goals unlocking awesome alternate arts and expanding the card pool. Whether you're a seasoned trading card game player or new to the genre, Paragon offers an intuitive and engaging experience that's easy to learn but hard to master. Play now and become the ultimate Paragon. I'm personally extremely excited for the release of this game and will be keeping my eye on the Kickstarter. Thanks to the Paragon team for sponsoring today's video. For the uninitiated, Netherworld Death is a 6-cost 3 reduction nexus that for 0 on level 1 has draw a card when your opponent's spirit's exhausted. There's no timing, and this is really kind of where the crutch of the card really kind of centralizes the entire game. Effectively, it says, in any way, shape, or form, if your opponent interacts with the combat step that revolves their spirits in any way, you will be able to draw a card, whether that's offensively, whether that's defensively. And now that we have green that has the ability to exhaust your opponent's spirits, that problem is just kind of exasperated even more. And then for some reason, it has a level 2 that says if you have 3 cores on it during your attack step, if one of your spirits gets blocked, you can remove a core from it to be able to destroy that spirit, which in its own right is kind of nutty. The fact that it can also force your opponent to have to trade up if it ever does trade. It doesn't come up super often, but is a very relevant ability in the matchups where it does matter. So to that end, it is an incredibly impactful card. And then there's the idea that, well, it's balanced, right? It costs 6. But now we just got green, which gave us access to cards like Worker Ant and Emerant and a bunch of ways to very proactively be able to ramp up, meaning that, which is to say, we're able to way more proactively get into Netherworld Depths without having to rely on our opponent. Previously, there was a little bit of a back and forth in that, sure, you could drop Depths on turn 2, but if your opponent aggroes you out because you weren't able to establish a board by paying the 6 cores, then that could mean trouble. But now with the tools that the format has, far outweighs the benefits of being able to go into a Depths and then having a ton of defensive options to back you up, being able to draw you into cards. And that's really kind of where I think the whole notion of how powerful Depths is very much its card advantage. And the fact that you have such a powerful card advantage engine in a color that has such quality and so many amount of ways to be able to draw cards. And then on the fact that it's just like, hey, if this goes unanswered, it's drawing 2, 3, 4 cards in one combat cycle, means that it's super splashable in any color, which means that we see a huge representation of not only purple, but this card specifically in, honestly, the majority of top placements. Now, that's not to say I think every single color in Battle Spirits Saga needs to have the same level of draw power. I recognize that there's a whole component to color identity, which is specific to the way that colors are able to draw cards or gain advantage. To that end, though, I do think we're a little too tight right now in what other colors can do to counteract how much card draw purple, and to an extension red, has versus the other colors, which lends it to be the more consistent and more pressing color and representation. As an example, if we look towards MTG, for a long time, MTG was really stuck towards 3 colors really having ways to draw cards or gain advantage, and then the other 2 not so much. But at some point, came to the decision that card draw is too inherent of a component of card games to seclude it to specific colors, so instead decided to give an identity to the way that cards draw. So specifically, blue just draws cards. It is the card advantage color. It is the one that will just flat out be able to do that. In black, you have cards like Ad Nauseam and other cards where it's like, you can draw, but it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you life. Very often, it's going to have a cost of body. So in general, it's cards, but at a cost, more so than just the mana cost. And then you get into green. Hey, depending on what your board has, you're going to be able to draw more cards. Hey, do you have a big guy on your board and we want to reward that board-based gameplay that green is known for? You're going to be able to draw some cards, so here's your condition. And then from here, for a long time, this is basically the colors that we're able to have advantage. But then we got more ways in which they decided to introduce the other colors into being able to draw cards. For red, we got impulsive draw, just like Jessica's Will here says, hey, you can exile cards from the top of your deck, and for a very temporary period, usually till the end of your turn, until the end of your opponent's turn, you're able to use these cards, which allows you to be able to really dig into that color identity of, hey, I'm passionate, I'm bursting, and I'm going to use these, but at least we have a way to be able to draw cards. And then in white, it's things like taxing. Hey, you know what? If you're not going to pay a little bit extra for that card that you got, you're going to allow me to draw a card. And it's in those kinds of natures in which now every color is represented in having some form of advantage, which, hey, we're a card game. Card advantage is inherent to every single way this game is played, regardless. And it's why some of the most powerful cards in any card games are the ones that say, draw cards. Draw to anybody? So then the question becomes, how does Battle Spirits does this? And we can look at every color to kind of see how their identities do it, because there is a certain level of identity in how each color does it, but it tends to be a little skewed towards a couple of colors and then not so much the further we go down. So in terms of red, red is the color that just gets to draw. It is the unconditional, hey, I'm just going to draw cards, the most notable of which are things like Scorched Battlefield, Starblast Draw. Volcanic Canyon isn't draw, but it's like card quality, and it ties in oftentimes with the draw slot in a lot of decks. So I kind of count it in here, even though I'm well aware that it's not actually a draw engine, but it does allow you to dig deeper, which ups your quality. So it's like close enough. These are the feature cards for that color, but realistically, red has this many ways to be able to draw cards. I'm honestly, I'm probably forgetting one or two. But generally speaking, they have so many ways. Charge draw is seen play. Nexus Hazard can draw a card, but it's not effectively just card draw. And then you have so many spirits that just, hey, if I deal damage, draw a card. Or hey, if I swing, draw a card. So red very much is our blue. I'm just going to draw a card and have advantage. To that end, purple is very much a interactive draw. I'm going to be able to draw based on either the way things go into my trash or by forcing my opponent to have to play with my mechanics. And it's actually very similar to yellow in that front. However, the card quality and the way in which purple says, hey, I'm going to interact with you and I'm going to get card draw out of it is so much more proactive. Now you've got Netherworld Depths. Netherworld Depths just straight up says, hey, are you playing the game? I'm going to draw a card. So we can put a stop on that one for a second. But cards like Rotting Swamp, we're on level 1, draw a card when one of your spirits is destroyed. And it's very similar to the way that yellow does it, but is way more tight when you consider the fact that purple is the color that can destroy its own cards and you're going to get draws. Has little weenies with curse, which means you can trade up. It has bodies that you want to really get rid of, and then you're incentivized to be able to do something about it. Thus, you will get your draws. You have big creatures like Nemesis, which is able to draw cards off the destruction of your own spirits. So in that way, you have so much more draw power in the way that you're interacting with your opponent because you yourself can be more proactive with it. Then you got spirits like Dragonaga Assassin, swing, draw a card. Dark Lancer, play, draw a card. Dark Knight Aglavale, die with Soul Core, draw a card. So a lot of it is cycle, or a lot of it is just pure card draw, which is incredibly good, especially in a color that can recur bodies like these. That said, purple has an insane quality of ways to be able to muster advantage, either through direct card draw or being able to take cards from your trash. Just like this isn't covering all of it. There's some recursion I missed. Nemesis isn't even on here, and he draws few cards. And if combos with Lamorak, it means you're not actually losing the card that you're stacking off. Anyways, there are so many combo lines and ways that purple draws advantage that lends it to be so incredibly good, especially when it's tied with the fact that the card quality in purple is some of the best in the game. Now, oddly enough, like I was saying before, yellow is very similar in the way that it gets card advantage. It just has less of it, and the quality is less, and the way that it forces you to interact with your opponent isn't as tight. So here we have cards like Blessed Cathedral. For 3 cores, draw a card when one of your yellow spirits is destroyed during either attack step. Phantasmal Paradise. Hey, do you play any Fabled Beast? You can exhaust this to be able to draw a card. But again, one-time use. And then you have cards that kind of give you card advantage on the way that your spirits die, because clearly you expect your yellow spirits to die, and it's the way that you're going to draw cards. I mean, Frietzel, draw a card when one of your spirits that costs 2 is destroyed, right? Like, we want our spirits to get destroyed, and that's how we get advantage. And then we see that in Spiral Tower. Hey, did one of your things die? Well, actually, you can make it not die and just go to hand instead. Hey, did something die? Well, then look at the top of your deck. If it's the same cost, then you're able to draw that, right? There's a number of ways in which yellow says, hey, I want you to interact with me and I'm going to get advantage out of it. The problem is that yellow is so reliant on Blessed Cathedral staying on board, or the specific ways in which it needs to be interacted with to get its card draw. Frietzel, for example, will only get card draw during BP comparison, which means that you can actually Burning Force it and remove it, and then they'll never get any draw. So it is interactive draw in the same way that purple, but it is way more tied to the combat step and actually having something to do in combat. And unfortunately, because that is such a tight, specific way to have to be interacted with, it's not as proactive as, let's say, purple, and thus lends itself that yellow can pop off. And we've seen games even at the top level where yellow does insane things, but it is off the back of things like Blessed Cathedral, of Phantasmal Paradise, of Frietzel just being able to stick on board. And unfortunately, because everyone's playing red to deal with purple, means that yellow is an incredibly terrible position to be able to do any of that, because it doesn't have the same level of resiliency that, let's say, a color like purple has. It doesn't have the same level of bombs that, say, that color has to make up for the fact that at some point your draw engines are going to be dealt with. And then from this point, the draw engines really dampen. If we get to white, and this has been white's issue ever since set 1, we know that you basically have 3 options. And mind you guys, I might be missing a card here or two, but really like the ones that people would consider playing. Nomen, there's a reason Nomen is almost always a 4 of in every single white deck. It can just propel you so far forward in terms of advantage. It's just absolutely necessary. And then the level 2 of being able to have refresh steps over and over again is absolutely massive. If we continue that, we've got Mammoth Aegis. I love this card, but again, if you're behind, you get to draw a card. Also, he costs 8. And then you got God Mech Donar, which you can sack off your tokens to be able to draw cards. So again, interactive draw. Hey, you need to get rid of my elephant. Hey, I need to be behind. Hey, I need to sack off things on my board. And so many less options. Really, there aren't that many in this color. Now, the ones that do exist are very powerful. Don't get me wrong. Nomen is an excellent card, and when it dies, it's incredibly insane how much of a tempo swing that can be. But it is very much tied down to a specific type of interaction that can be played around. There is no worse feeling than getting your Nomen that you paid full 8 cost for being dream bombed. So how did white mitigate that in the past? Well, like we saw with the Axe Spider decks that dominated the Pro Tour, it ran Netherworld Depths. And previously before that, I've ran white decks that run Starblast Draw and Volcanic Canyon. So you just have to go elsewhere to be able to get that draw advantage. And most recently, green was introduced to the game. And there is one card that allows you to draw cards, and it costs 3 maintenance cores. Sacred Tree Stump City is a 4-cost 2 green reduction nexus. On levels 1, 2, during your attack step, the first spirit you control that attacks each turn gains 1 KBP for each green spirit you control. And then on level 2, for 3 cores, during your opponent's attack step, draw a card when your opponent reduces your life. So it is incredibly just, hey, my opponent could never attack me, can control my board the entire time, and at one point will be able to blow me out. And it's just, if you're holding on to 3 cores to be able to draw a card, if your opponent hits you, you're not interacting with your opponent, you're not expanding your game state as fast as you could be, and it just does not play out in the way that it's meant to. If this was its level 1 ability, honestly, whole different discussion. But the fact that it's not means it is such a tough pill to swallow. Now, mind you, there are other ways that you can get advantage in a card game, right? They're not specifically tied to just drawing a card. There are ways you can draw a card in alternative ways. We've seen that with purple being able to recur things from their trash, and white and green, the 2 colors that don't have draw at all, really, are the ones that got the token support. Now, playing a token is gaining a card. Now, some would argue that a token is like a third of a card, half a card's worth of value, but at the end of the day, it is another way that these colors can accrue value in a way that is similar to card draw, but not directly card draw. And that is very powerful and a thing to consider. Unfortunately, it hasn't played out in a way that has really lent these colors to be able to stand on their own 2 legs without having to rely on other support. So now that we understand where every color lies in terms of draw representation and the ways that they do draw and how much options they have for draw, what does that look like in terms of where everything stacks up? Well, you have purple and red in basically tier 1, purple and red having not only the best draw, but also red being the best one to answer draw. So you're either going to see yourself being a depths deck or a red deck that answers depths incredibly well, because you are the color that deals with everything and specifically has the most options to remove nexus. In terms of tier 2 advantage, you have yellow and white. Yellow having tons of options, just very restrictive in the way that you're able to get it off and can be answered quite easily. And then you have white, which is like, it's hard to get online, but when you do is absolutely insane. And then finally, we have green. which has basically none. And I understand, right? Green is a very powerful color. If you give a color that dumps its hand incredibly quickly and can establish very solid boards, additional draw, it can lead to some very oppressive game states. And I understand the balance factor that brings in. But unfortunately, it does lend into these scenarios where you have these colors that are so far above the rest that we end up having very centralized formats. We just had the European Grand Open happen in the Netherlands, and here is the top 8 cut. Of which you have 3 pterosaur decks, 3 purple decks, and I'm grouping the winning deck by Atugron, which congratulations on the winner, the white-purple Axspire deck, because it is a depths deck. It is a deck that will use depths and abuse depths, along with having blockers that can block all day long to be able to accrue the card advantage it needs to be able to get into the late game. Also, shout out to Aaron, who actually got in there with white aggro. Huge props. But this is very much the crux of the issue. Unfortunately, because of the insane amount of draw and locking out of a specific component of the game that Depths does, the format becomes a play Depths or beat Depths. And unfortunately, this would be better if every color had better ways to deal with Nexuses, but really they only exist reliably in red, which means every deck ends up running 4 Burning Forces, and then the ones that do that the best are red. And then if they want additional ways to deal with that, there's also red. And this is where we could almost consider that there's an issue with the format. So in identifying that, why is Depth so good? Well, Depth is absolutely insane because, once again, it locks out an entire phase of the game, and then it adds onto that by being a complete blowout the longer it goes. Unlike its contemporaries, its restrictions are so generic that unfortunately it far outclasses what any of them do, to a point where yellow decks are playing Cathedral so that they can bait out Burning Force removal so that they can stick Depths on board, which is absolutely nuts. And you would think the 6 cost would mitigate that, but unfortunately, turns out it's totally worth it to pay 6 to potentially draw a card. If not, they Burning Force it, but then that costs them their turn. So you guys just passed a turn and you kind of like gained a core in that sense. Or they don't, it goes unanswered, and then you completely walk away with the game. Then you add on top of that the introduction of green and so many more ways to exhaust your opponent's spirits without them really having a say in the matter. And then you're putting yourself in a position to be able to draw even more cards. To that end, if you want to counter that, right? Say like, hey, if your opponent plays an on summon that exhausts one of your spirits, well, maybe you can get a draw with Star Blessed Draw. That's in red, and then further incentivizes red to be able to push through Netherworld Depths and then creating this kind of back and forth 2-color format. One of the cruxes of this issue is naturally, well, then how do we deal with Depths? And unfortunately, there's very few ways in which you deal with Depths, and many of them are in red. You got Burning Force, which people are basically playing as a 4 of in every single deck at this point, which at least it can actually punish your opponent if they go wide. So there's that. But nevertheless, there's Burning Force. Andromeda was a great option at the set 1 format. And now we've got King Vulture, which very specifically only hits 3 or 6 costs to be able to destroy them. So it's a very much a targeted Depths removal. In other colors, and I think every color potentially has some, but I'm more so sticking to the ones that may likely see play. In yellow, you can turn off the ability, so you can run Spirit Angel, where if they main phase exhaust your stuff, they don't get the draw. Or you can Scout Crondale, which during the attack step, they won't be able to get their draw. So there's that, but then the purple player can play around it by just putting 3 cores on Depths and then making it a level 2. So, hey, there's that to consider. And then you have Dream Blizzard, which just bounces everything. Now, that's great for tempo, but at the same time, you are costing yourself your own Nexuses, so you need to line it up in a very specific way to not get super punished by it. There's Dream Bomb also, but Dream Bomb, you don't include Dream Bomb for the sake of bouncing your opponent's Nexus. That's really not where you want to be. Incidentally, does it do that? And that's great. But if that's the reason you're running Dream Bomb in your deck, we're in a really bad spot for Nexus removal. And that's the crux of the issue. Very clearly, red is the best at dealing with Nexus, which means that it's the best at dealing with Depths, and can apply enough pressure while having its own card draw that is incredibly well lined up with the rest of the format. Star Blessed being able to draw you 4 cards for 2 costs if you have all your reductions means that we are very much in a Depths or not Depths format. It's centralized around beating this card or abusing this card. And unfortunately, that creates a lot of scenarios, right? Basically, every Battle Spirits deck at this point, if you are a Depths deck, you're starting with 4 Netherworld Depths, 4 Burning Forces, 4 Absolute Ice Shields, 0 to 3 Thorn Prisons, maybe 4 Worker Ants to be able to get to Depths the turn after you swing and get your ramp. And then if you're not a Depths deck, well, then you're running 4 to 6 Nexus removal as a red deck. So 4 Depths, and then like 2 Vultures or 2 Andromeda. And then you're running 4 Ice Shields, and then you're running X amount of suppression so you can block and prevent Depths from getting more draws off your blocks. And so you can clearly see how this card and the way in which it draws cards is so inherently generically insane that it pushes the entire game to centralize around it. It was already starting to look like that around the start of set 1 and really kind of maximized its way in the Pro Tour. And now we're really looking at the set 2 format being this card. There are ways you can get there. You can punch them in the mouth before they're able to draw cards, right? Like we saw with white aggro being able to get there in today's top 8. And you would think that's where it is, right? Like punish the fact that this is slow by punching them in the mouth. But unfortunately, the defensive options that are currently available for these colors do lend that to be much harder, especially since the comeback mechanic of hitting your opponent gives them more cores to play more insane comeback cards that they just drew off the depths. I think in general, what's the answer? Better answers to Nexuses. I don't know if I want to see a limit. I think if we were going to touch the amount of depths that are in the game, it would either be all or none, just so that I don't have to play around an RNG factor when we're coming to limiting cards. I've never been a fan of that at all. And errata could be it. I don't love errata. It's not exactly elegant, but an errata that only specifies whether it's on my opponent's attack step or my attack step. Preferably, I would say it'd be better to be my attack step so that it goes into purple's whole thing of you don't want to block me, which is what like Curse is and Swamp is and stuff like that. So I think that's where the card wants to be. As it is now, is incredibly centralizing, incredibly powerful. And I don't see myself really building a deck that's not red or beating Netherworld Depths right now, the way that the False Gods format is playing out. But with that said, guys, maybe that's just me. Maybe you guys have a whole different experience with Netherworld Depths. So let me know in the comments down below what you guys think. And with that said, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Ciao.